He wasn't supposed to be there. A U.S. veteran cutting through a winter job site, boots crunching on snow-dusted concrete, was only looking for a faster way home and maybe a quieter way to breathe. But the bridge ahead wasn't finished. No rails, no mercy. Just a raw slab of beton hanging over a gorge like a dare from the mountain itself. Then the silence broke. A thin, strangled gasp. The kind that doesn't belong in the wind. At the edge, a police officer was dangling by her fingertips, gloves soaked, strength bleeding out one tremor at a time. Her eyes locked upward, not begging, not screaming, just refusing to disappear. And right as her hand slipped, the veteran lunged and caught her wrist. But the bridge didn't stop trying to take them. He started sliding too, until a German shepherd behind him clamped its jaws onto his jacket and pulled like fate had teeth. What you're about to hear isn't just a rescue, it's a trade, a hand for a hand, a life for a life. And later, when the dog falls and the officer reaches down the same way she was saved, everything changes. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe second chances can come with fur, scars, and a heartbeat that won't quit, hit subscribe. This story is proof that even on an unfinished bridge, something in us still chooses to hold on. Winter strangled the Colorado pines, and an unfinished concrete bridge lay across the gorge. No guardrails, only slick snow, raw edges, and rebar rising like teeth. Mason Reed wasn't supposed to be here, but supposed to had stopped meaning anything the day a roadside blast overseas turned his world into smoke. 32 and a touch over 6 feet, he carried himself like a man built from restraint, shoulders tight, chin tucked, eyes scanning as if danger could hide inside ordinary trees. Dark blonde hair sat short and uneven at the sides, light stubble roughened the hard line of his jaw. A faded scar split one eyebrow, and his eyes, hazel with a tired green ring, held that particular look veterans wore when they smiled at neighbors and still listened for distant thunder. He dressed the way he always did when he wanted to be invisible. A worn brown leather jacket, cracked at the seams and dulled by years of weather, over a red and black plaid flannel that had once been bright and was now the color of old bruises. Blue jeans, brown boots with salt-stained seams. A chain with dog tags lay under his shirt, cool against his chest like a reminder that the past could be quiet and still heavy. Mason wasn't cruel to people. He was polite, even gentle, the kind of man who held doors open and said sir without thinking, but he kept a measured distance, because closeness meant questions, and questions led to names he couldn't say without tasting dust. The dog at his side softened him in small, stubborn ways. Ranger, an 8-year-old German shepherd, moved with the heavy confidence of a working dog. Black and tan, thick winter coat, broad shoulders, one ear tipped from an old tear, he looked like a guardian carved out of practical muscle. His amber eyes missed very little. He never pulled the leash unless something mattered, and when he looked at Mason, there was an almost comical seriousness to it. Like Ranger was the responsible adult, and Mason was the reckless one who needed supervision. Mason liked that about him. A dog didn't care about excuses. A dog cared about what happened next. They reached a construction site where the forest opened into churned earth and pale concrete. The bridge project had been abandoned mid-sentence, a flat deck stretching over empty air, edges bare, safety rails never installed, rebar clustered where barriers should have been. Snow turned the surface into glass. Mason usually avoided it. Today he took the shortcut anyway, chasing a faster way back to his cabin and a slower way away from his thoughts. The gorge below stayed hidden under fog, but Mason could feel the drop, the way you feel a cliff, even when you refuse to look straight down, an invisible weight tugging at your stomach. The moment his boots hit concrete, the sound changed. Snow on dirt muffled. Snow on concrete cracked. Wind threaded through the rebar and whistled in thin notes that made Mason's nerves jump too much like the ringing in his ears after the blast. He forced himself to breathe slow, in, hold, out. He stayed centered, careful not to let his boots drift toward the edges. The bridge offered no apology if you slipped. It didn't even look like it would remember you. Halfway across, Ranger stopped. It wasn't a casual pause. Ranger froze so hard it looked like someone had carved him from winter. Ears forward, tail lowered into a straight line of focus. The fur along his shoulders rose. He lifted his nose to the wind, nostrils flaring, and made a low, urgent sound that wasn't quite a growl and wasn't quite a whine. Mason's body responded before his mind did. His hand came up instinctively, as if to grab a weapon that wasn't there. His eyes swept the far end of the bridge, then the trees, then the fog. Nothing obvious moved, just snowfall drifting in soft spirals, and the uneasy sense that the world had gone quiet on purpose. Ranger stepped toward the left edge, paused precise as if he were walking on shattered glass, and stared down. Mason's stomach tightened. Dogs didn't do this for drama. Mason crouched beside him, keeping his weight back, and leaned over the raw lip of concrete. At first he saw only fog and the dark geometry of rock. Then the fog shifted, and a human shape resolved beneath the edge, a woman clinging to the underside seam where the deck met the support. She wore a dark navy police uniform, the kind meant for streets, not for dangling above a winter gorge. A duty belt sat crooked at her waist from gravity's tug. Her right glove was torn, bare fingers hooked over the bridge edge, skin scraped raw and streaked with blood where she'd clawed for purchase. Her left hand clung to a bent loop of rebar, a grip so desperate it looked like it would slice her palm open if she held it too long. Her boots scraped the vertical face of the bridge, searching for a ledge that didn't exist. Officer Lily Harper looked late 20s, 28, maybe with an athletic build and a stubborn posture even while hanging. Her face was lean, cheekbones sharp, wind-burned pink across the nose and cheeks, lips pale from cold. Dark brown hair had been pulled into a tight bun, but strands had escaped and stuck to her forehead in wet curls. Her eyes were gray-blue and awake in the worst way, the eyes of someone who'd been betrayed and hadn't had time to be shocked about it. Mason noticed bruising on the inside of her wrist. Finger-shaped angry purple like someone had grabbed her hard. Lily's thoughts came in jagged flashes, the way cold turns time into broken glass. A pickup with no plates, a tarp-covered load that clinked like metal. The moment she stepped off the county road to follow tire tracks into the trees, telling herself it was just a quick check before she called it in. Then the dead zone, her radio spitting nothing but static as the canyon swallowed signal. She'd found fresh boot prints near the bridge approach and a small stash tucked under plastic sheeting, crates stamped with generic shipping marks that meant nothing, which was exactly what made them suspicious. Then the footsteps behind her, the shove that wasn't a shove so much as a decision made by someone else. Lily had tried to plant her boots, but snow had turned concrete into betrayal, and the bridge with no guardrails had offered her only two choices: fall fast or fight slow. So she fought slow. She clung. She refused to become a missing person report with a polite paragraph and a closed file. Lily's gaze snapped up and locked onto Mason's face. For half a heartbeat, disbelief flickered there, like she couldn't accept that the last witness to her life might be a stranger in a battered jacket and a German shepherd with a torn ear. Her lips moved. The wind stole the sound, but the meaning was clear. Warning and plea tangled together. "Don't come closer. Please come closer." Her fingers trembled. The edge was icy. Strength drained 1 millimeter at a time. She tried to make her voice work anyway. Air scraped out of her throat in a thin, broken sound that might have been "run," because she didn't want a civilian dragged into her mess, and might have been help, because survival has a way of outranking pride. Seeing her like that punched straight through Mason's practiced numbness. It wasn't only the danger. It was the familiarity of the moment, the way helplessness tried to sit on his shoulders like a heavy pack. He remembered another ledge, another place where he'd reached and been too late. The memory didn't arrive as a story. It arrived as sensation, the taste of dust, the sting in his eyes, the sick realization that you can do everything right and still lose someone. His hands started to shake. He hated that his body remembered failure better than it remembered peace. He hated that part of him wanted to freeze, because freezing meant not choosing, and not choosing meant not being responsible. Ranger broke that temptation first. The dog let out a sharp, urgent whine and braced his paws wider, nails scraping on concrete for traction, as if preparing to anchor something far bigger than a dog should be able to hold. Mason felt Ranger's shoulder press into his thigh, steady as a hand on the spine. It almost made him laugh, a thin, bitter laugh with no sound, because of course this was his life now, a broken veteran on a railless bridge being supervised by a dog with better judgment. Ranger's eyes seemed to say, less thinking, more moving. Mason's throat tightened. He lowered himself to his knees, careful, slow, keeping his center of gravity back while inching his torso toward the edge. He didn't look away from Lily's eyes. He couldn't. If he looked away, she would become another name he never said out loud. "Hey!" he called, voice rough from disuse. "Don't move. Don't just hold on." The words sounded ridiculous against the wind, but he said them anyway, like a charm, like a promise. Lily tried to obey, pressing her forearm to the concrete seam, boots scraping uselessly for a ledge that wasn't there. Snowflakes melted on her eyelashes. Above her, Ranger's breath steamed in short bursts, and Mason felt time narrow down to one trembling wrist and one decision. Lily's fingers slipped again, a tiny skid on ice. Her breath hitched into a ragged gasp. The gorge below waited, patient and endless, and the unfinished bridge offered nothing but raw concrete and the blunt truth of gravity. Winter held its breath while Officer Lily Harper's grip began to fail. Mason's fingers locked around Lily Harper's wrist just as gravity tried to claim her, and the shock of contact ran through him like a live wire. Her skin was cold through the torn glove cold in a way that felt wrong for a person who was still breathing. The bridge beneath him offered no kindness. Snow had glazed the unfinished concrete into a slick, treacherous sheet, and Mason's knees began to drift forward with the slow inevitability of a nightmare. His shoulder flared with pain as Lily's weight pulled, not a clean pull, but a jerking, desperate tug as her body swung and fought for anything to press against. The gorge below swallowed sound, but it couldn't swallow the truth. One mistake, and they would both go down together. Ranger reacted before Mason's thoughts could fully form. The German shepherd's paws scraped and bit into the snowy surface, nails finding microscopic purchase where human boots failed. Ranger lunged close, not barking, not panicking, just moving with that stern, practical urgency he always wore like a uniform. Then his jaws clamped into the back of Mason's leather jacket, right where the shoulder seam met the collar, a firm bite that didn't tear, but anchored. Ranger's teeth set like a lock on a door. The dog's body leaned backward, muscles bunching under thick fur, hind legs spreading wide as he pulled with the steady violence of purpose. Mason felt the bite as both pain and blessing, like being yanked back from the edge of a decision he didn't want to make. He tried to shift his weight, to plant an elbow, but the moment he moved, his boot slipped again and his stomach dropped. He was sliding. The edge came closer. The fog below looked like an open mouth. "Ranger!" he choked, and the dog answered with a low, strained grunt, pulling harder, dragging Mason's torso a few inches back from the lip. Lily's eyes were wide and furious, not at Mason, but at the world. She was trying to help, kicking her boots against the vertical face of the bridge, searching for any protrusion, any rebar loop, any cracked seam that could become a foothold. Her duty belt clinked faintly. The sound was absurdly ordinary, like keys in a pocket, and it made Mason's chest tighten with a sudden anger. How could something as small as a belt buckle still exist when a human life was about to end? "Don't swing," Mason rasped, voice scraped raw by the wind. "Get your forearm up. I need you to." He didn't finish the sentence because Lily's fingers spasmed and slipped another fraction. Her wrist twisted in his grip. He tightened, careful not to crush bone, but firm enough to keep her tethered to the living world. He leaned his cheek against the concrete, feeling the cold seep into his skin, and forced his mind into the same narrow tunnel he'd used in combat. No past, no future, just the next 3 seconds. Ranger kept pulling. Mason's jacket creaked under the strain. Leather always sounded like it was protesting, even when it held. "Okay," Mason said, not to Lily, but to his own shaking body. "Okay. I've got you. I've got you." The words felt stupid and holy at the same time. Lily tried again to brace. Her left hand still clung to bent rebar under the deck seam, but her grip was failing. The metal had cut into her palm. Blood streaked down her wrist and vanished into her sleeve. Mason saw purple bruising there too, the finger-shaped marks that didn't belong to an accident. Someone had grabbed her. Someone had chosen this place because the bridge had no guardrails and the gorge took secrets without asking questions. Lily's face tightened as the realization that she might actually survive collided with the shame of needing help. She had the kind of pride that came from being the one who arrived when others called 911. Now she was the emergency. She tried to force her breathing steady, but it came out in ragged bursts. "You shouldn't be here," she managed, voice thin as paper in the wind. "Get back." "I'm already here," Mason said, and surprised himself by sounding calm. The truth was he didn't feel calm. His heart was pounding so hard it made his ribs ache. But his voice belonged to the old Mason, the one who had learned that panic was contagious and steady words could be a rope. He dug his free hand into the snow and found nothing. The surface was too slick. He needed leverage, something solid. His eyes snapped to the rebar clusters jutting from the unfinished deck where railings should have been installed. Rust red, half buried in frost, they looked like the ribs of a giant animal. Mason shifted carefully, inching his torso sideways without releasing Lily. It felt like moving a loaded gun. Ranger adjusted too, keeping his bite and changing his angle, pulling not straight back now but slightly diagonal, trying to keep Mason from drifting toward the lip. The dog's eyes were narrowed with effort, amber and unblinking, as if the entire universe had shrunk to hold. "Listen," Mason said, his breath clouding. "I'm going to move my right knee. When I do, you pull your arm up. Not your whole body, just your arm. Get your elbow on the edge." Lily's laugh was a harsh, humorless puff. "Sure," she said, and it sounded like she was mocking herself for being alive enough to have sarcasm. Still, she nodded. Her bun had loosened. Dark hair stuck to her forehead. She looked young in that moment, not because she was inexperienced, but because desperation strips titles away. She was just a woman over a void. Mason shifted. His knee slid, but Ranger yanked, and Mason's hip slammed against the concrete hard enough to jar his teeth. Pain flared down his side. He ignored it. Lily seized the moment and hauled her right forearm up, muscles trembling. Her elbow hooked the edge. For the first time her weight shifted from pure hanging to partial bracing. Mason's grip on her wrist remained the tether, but now she had something else, a point of contact that belonged to her. "Good," Mason breathed. "Good. Again." Lily gritted her teeth and tried to bring her left hand up from the rebar loop, but her palm slipped on blood and frost. The metal tore at her glove. She hissed. Mason's mind flashed to training. When someone is stuck, you don't ask them to do two things at once. You break the problem into smaller victories. "Leave the left hand," he said quickly. "Just get your chest higher. Use your elbow like a hook." "I'm trying," Lily snapped, and he heard the fear under the anger. Fear always wore disguises. For Mason, it wore silence. For Lily, it wore sharpness. Ranger suddenly jerked his head, not releasing the jacket but shifting his stance. His ears flicked. He was listening to something beyond the bridge, the forest approach, the wind patterns, the faintest disturbance. Mason didn't want to look away, but Ranger's body language punched through him like an alarm. Somewhere out there, something was moving that wasn't snow. Mason's throat tightened. Lily's bruises made a new kind of sense now. She hadn't fallen. She'd been pushed, which meant the pushers might still be near. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered, as if reading his thought. Her eyes flicked past him toward the tree line. She couldn't see much from her angle, but she could sense the shift in Ranger's posture. Mason held steady, choosing the simplest truth. "Not yet," he said, "but we don't have time." He tried to find an anchor with his free hand and finally managed to hook 2 fingers around a short rebar stub protruding from the deck surface. It wasn't meant to hold a man's life, but neither were most things. He curled his fingers tighter, knuckles whitening, and began to pull. Lily pushed with her elbow, dragging herself upward inch by inch. Her uniform jacket scraped against concrete, making a rasping sound that drilled into Mason's nerves. He couldn't stop imagining her slipping, the sudden absence, his hand closing on empty air. He tried not to imagine it. He focused on sensation, Ranger's bite, the sting in his shoulder, the cold in his lungs, Lily's wrist bones under his palm. Lily's face crested the edge. She was close enough now that Mason could see tiny freckles across her cheekbones, a faint scar on her chin, and the way her pupils widened every time the wind gusted. She was fighting not just gravity, but shock. "Almost," Mason said, the word coming out like a prayer he didn't believe in, but said anyway. Lily's left hand finally released the rebar loop with a wet, reluctant sound. She slapped her palm onto the deck, fingers splayed, blood smearing across snow. She got both forearms on the surface. Mason shifted backward, dragging her with him while Ranger pulled in sync, like they were all connected by one shared spine. Lily's boots scraped the bridge face. Then finally her knee found the edge. She heaved and Mason's shoulder screamed, but his grip didn't fail. Ranger's growl deepened into effort. Lily rolled onto the deck in a clumsy, exhausted collapse that looked more like a fall than a rescue. For a moment, all three simply existed. Mason on his stomach, Ranger still biting his jacket, Lily sprawled on her side, chest heaving as if she'd been running for miles. Snow landed on Lily's eyelashes and melted. Her lips trembled. Mason released her wrist slowly, flexing his fingers as if they didn't belong to him. Ranger let go of the jacket and immediately shoved his nose into Lily's shoulder, sniffing hard, checking her like she was part of the pack now, whether she agreed or not. Lily flinched at first, then let out a shaky breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Your dog," she rasped, "just saved your life." Mason's mouth twitched. "He does that," he said, then surprised himself by adding, "He likes being right." Lily coughed, then winced as pain traveled up her scraped palms. She pushed herself into a sitting position, boots planted, and looked toward the forest approach with a cop's instinct that didn't shut off just because she'd almost died. Her gaze landed on the abandoned construction area, stacked forms, half-buried tarps, tire tracks softened by snow. Her jaw tightened. "They're close," she said. It wasn't a guess. It was a memory. Mason followed her eyes. Ranger's ears stayed forward, body angled like a shield. The bridge had given Lily back, but it wasn't done asking for blood. Somewhere in the trees, the people who wanted her gone were still breathing, still moving, and now they knew she hadn't fallen far enough. Mason pulled his knees under him and rose carefully, testing his balance on the slick deck. He offered Lily a hand. She hesitated, pride tugging one way, survival tugging harder, then took it. Her grip was iron despite the tremble. "Officer Lily Harper," she said, as if names were anchors. "Mason Reed," he replied, "and that's Ranger." Ranger didn't look up. He was watching the tree line like it had personally offended him. Lily's bruised wrist throbbed in the cold. Mason's shoulder burned. But both of them felt the same new truth settle into place. They were no longer dealing with an accident. They were dealing with a hunt, and the bridge was only the beginning. The first thing that arrived was light. 2 pale blades slicing through the fog and snow, sweeping across the abandoned bridge deck like searchlights in a prison yard. The second thing was sound. Boots on concrete. Not the casual shuffle of hikers, not the heavy stomp of workers with tool belts, but the clipped, purposeful cadence of men who moved like they'd done this before. Ranger stiffened, hackles rising again, and Lily's head snapped toward the far end of the bridge as if the cold hadn't just tried to kill her. She was still sitting on the deck with blood on her palms and snow melting in her hair, but the moment she heard those steps, the helplessness slid off her like a shed coat. Her spine straightened, her jaw set. Fear didn't vanish. It sharpened, becoming something she could aim. "They're here," she said, voice low and hoarse, and Mason felt the weight of the words in his bones. He followed her gaze. 4 silhouettes emerged where the bridge met the tree line. 4 men framed by fog, backlit by headlights, their outlines wrong for construction. No reflective vests, no hard hats, no relaxed posture. They moved in a loose line, spacing themselves like they were trying to cover angles, and even from this distance, Mason could read the story in their shoulders. Confidence, impatience, and that subtle, predatory calm that said they expected the world to step aside. The closest one, a tall man with a hooded parka and a square, blunt build, held a flashlight in one hand and something long and dark in the other that wasn't a tool. Another man, shorter and stockier, carried a crowbar like he'd used it for both doors and faces. Their breath made faint clouds as they advanced. Lily's bruised wrist throbbed. She reached for her radio, clipped to her shoulder mic, and pressed the transmit button. Static burst out, then a broken chirp, like a dying bird. She tried again, turning her body toward the gorge as if orientation could change signal. "Dispatch, this is Officer Lily Harper." The radio answered with nothing but snow hiss. The canyon swallowed her voice as thoroughly as it swallowed phone bars. Lily's eyes flashed with frustration, not because she expected miracles, but because she was used to systems working. This place had no system, only choices. Mason crouched beside her and saw her hands shaking now that adrenaline was ebbing, saw the blood smearing in the snow, saw the tremor in her lips that she tried to hide by biting the inside of her cheek. He didn't ask if she could run. There was no time for polite questions. Ranger took 2 steps forward, placing himself between them and the advancing men, body angled like a living barricade. His growl was low and steady, more warning than panic. Mason's own instincts dragged him into the same tunnel as on the bridge edge. Identify, move, survive. He scanned the unfinished deck. No guardrails, patches of slick ice, rebar stubs, a few stacked concrete forms near the side, half buried under tarp and snow. The men were closing the distance. "We need off the bridge," Lily said, already pushing herself to her feet. She winced as her scraped palms met cold air, then forced her hands to work anyway. She was average height, about 5'6", but she carried herself like she'd learned early how to take up space without asking permission. Her uniform jacket was scuffed, her duty belt knocked crooked, and her face, wind-burned and pale, still had that stubborn clarity of someone who refused to become a story other people told. Mason rose too, and the movement tugged his shoulder where Ranger's bite had yanked his jacket. Pain flared, but it was a clean pain reel, immediate, preferable to memory. "What did you see?" he asked her, keeping his voice controlled. "Enough," Lily said. "And I tried to call it in. That's why they chased me." She glanced down the bridge approach, then back at the men, and the smallest crack of humor broke through her tension. "Congratulations," she added, eyes flicking to Mason. "You just wandered into a crime scene." "Story of my life," Mason muttered, and Lily huffed once, half laugh, half breath. The humor didn't soften the danger. It just made the air easier to swallow. Ranger's ears twitched. He looked back at Mason once, not pleading, not asking, informing. The dog wanted direction, and in that moment Mason realized something that made his chest tighten. Ranger wasn't just loyal. Ranger was capable. The dog had read the bridge faster than Mason had anchored without being told, had sensed the approach before either human fully accepted it. Ranger wasn't a pet. He was a partner. Mason grabbed his belt at his waist. Earlier he'd used it as a quick safety tether while pulling Lily up. Now he ripped it free in one smooth motion and looped it around Lily's midsection, not tight enough to bruise, just enough to give him a handle if she slipped again on the slick surface. He threaded the belt through itself like a makeshift harness. "If you fall, you pull me," Lily warned, eyes hard. "If you fall," Mason said, "I pull you." He didn't say it like a romantic vow. He said it like a field rule. Lily's gaze held on his face for a second too long, as if she was trying to place his type. She could see the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his eyes kept checking angles, the practiced calm that didn't come from a quiet life. Then she nodded once, accepting what he was without asking for his resume. The men had reached the center span. The tallest raised his flashlight and painted the beam over them. "There she is," he called, voice thick with satisfaction. He sounded mid-30s, maybe older, with that rough edge common to men who smoked and shouted more than they listened. "You really thought you could disappear?" Lily's hand went to her holster. She stopped herself. Drawing a weapon on an icy bridge with no guardrails was a gamble with physics. The law didn't matter if gravity won first. "Back up," she ordered, voice carrying the authority of a uniform even when the system behind it was absent. "You're trespassing on an active site." The men laughed. It wasn't a belly laugh. It was the sound of people who believed rules were for other families. The stocky one with the crowbar spat into the snow and took another step. "Active?" he said. "Lady, this place been dead for months." Mason saw it then, how they moved like they had ownership over the bridge, how they didn't glance at the drop because they weren't afraid of it. They'd chosen this site because the bridge was unfinished, abandoned, and dangerous. Easy place for an accident. Easy place for a body to vanish. Lily's bruised wrist told him she'd already met their hands. Ranger's growl deepened. The dog's stance widened, claws scratching for traction. Mason whispered a single word, "Heel." Ranger didn't move away. He shifted closer to Mason's leg, still in front, a shield that listened. Mason's mind ran a rapid inventory. Fight here? Bad. Run? Possible, but only if they could break contact fast. The bridge exit behind them led back into the forest trail, but the men's vehicle headlights blocked much of that path. There might be another route construction access near the side, stacks of forms that could hide their movement. Ranger's nose dipped to the snow, then lifted. The dog's eyes flicked toward a pile of tarped material near the edge where the deck met a half-finished support platform. A worker's path, maybe, a narrow strip of compacted snow leading off the main deck toward the side. Ranger had found a line. The dog didn't speak, but he didn't need to. He looked like a general pointing to a flank route. Mason felt a grim appreciation rise in him, half pride, half disbelief. "Okay, Captain," Mason murmured under his breath to Ranger, and Ranger's tail twitched once, as if acknowledging the promotion. Lily glanced at Ranger's line of sight and understood immediately. Cops learned to read K-9s even if they didn't work with them. The body language was its own language. "We go left," she whispered. Mason nodded. He kept his eyes on the men while shifting his feet in slow, non-threatening steps, as if he were backing away out of compliance. Lily mirrored him. Ranger moved last, silent as smoke. The tall man's flashlight beam tracked them. "Where you think you're going?" he called, voice turning sharper. Mason didn't answer. Talking would only give the men the comfort of control. He waited until the last second, until the men were close enough to think they'd cornered them. Then he snapped, "Now!" Lily pivoted and sprinted toward the tarped stack. Her boots skidded, but Mason's belt harness gave him a grip and he yanked her upright before she fell. Ranger shot ahead, leading, paws finding traction in places Mason couldn't see. The dog's movement was smooth and decisive, like he'd walked this route in his head already. Behind them, the men shouted. Footsteps pounded harder. A flashlight beam swung wildly, cutting through fog in frantic arcs. Mason's lungs burned as he ran, but he welcomed the burn. It proved he was here, alive, moving, not trapped inside a memory. They reached the tarped stack. Ranger ducked under a sagging corner and disappeared, forcing the humans to follow. Beneath the tarp, the air smelled of wet cement and rubber. The space was tight, barely high enough to crouch, but it provided cover. Lily dropped to a knee, breath ragged, and tried her radio again. Static. Always static. She clenched her jaw and shoved the radio back against her shoulder as if it had personally betrayed her. "They have a vehicle at the approach," she whispered. "If they circle, we're done." "Then we don't let them circle," Mason said, surprising himself with the certainty. He wasn't in charge of a platoon anymore. He wasn't supposed to know what to do. But his body remembered how to move when hunted. Ranger's head emerged from the tarp edge, ears pricked. The dog sniffed the air and then, with deliberate mischief, trotted out the opposite side of the stack and scratched at the snow, leaving a set of clear paw prints leading away, bold, obvious, almost insulting. Then Ranger returned silently back under the tarp to Mason's side, eyes bright with a wicked intelligence that made Lily's mouth twitch. "Did your dog just plant fake tracks?" Lily breathed. Mason swallowed a laugh. "He's always had opinions," he said. Ranger's tail flicked like a smirk. The footsteps grew closer. Flashlight beams stabbed into the tarp's edges, searching. Mason held Lily's belt with one hand and pressed the other to Ranger's shoulders, keeping both anchored. His mind tightened into stillness, the kind of stillness that wasn't peace but preparation. The men were near enough now that Mason could hear their breathing, hear the scrape of the crowbar against concrete. He could also hear something else, faint and dangerous, the ease in their voices. They believed they would win. Lily's gaze met Mason's, and in that quick glance an agreement formed without words. They would not give these men the ending they expected. Under the tarp, with fog and snow and an unfinished bridge as their witness, Mason, Lily, and Ranger waited for the next move, knowing the hunt had truly begun. Snow muffled the world until every sound felt like it came from inside a skull. Under the tarp, Mason's breath fogged in slow bursts while the men outside prowled the stacks like wolves circling a wounded elk. Flashlight beams swept over the sagging plastic, then slid away. One of the men laughed softly, too close, too confident, and the sound made Lily's stomach turn. She kept her radio pressed to her shoulder anyway, as if sheer will could force signal through rock and winter. Static answered, stubborn as fate. Mason's eyes tracked the shadows through a small tear in the tarp. He could see boots' heavy tread, dirty snow packed into the grooves, and the occasional flash of a hand holding a light. Their voices were low, impatient, and familiar in the worst way. The language of men who believed disappearance was a simple thing, like tossing a stone into a river. Lily's scraped palms throbbed. Blood had dried in thin lines across her fingers, and the skin beneath the glove tear felt raw. She flexed her wrist and winced where bruises bloomed purple in the cold. Mason noticed anyway, because noticing was what kept people alive. "You said you saw something," he whispered. "Crates," Lily breathed back. Under tarp near the approach, metal inside, not construction supplies, and tire tracks fresh. "I called it in, then—" Her jaw tightened. "Then someone came up behind me like they knew exactly where I'd be." Mason's mouth went hard. He didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He'd learned that answers rarely mattered in the first minute of survival. Ranger shifted in the cramped space, shoulders brushing Mason's leg, nose lifting to taste the air. The German shepherd's winter coat collected fine snow that clung like powdered sugar, making him look momentarily harmless, like a dog in a holiday card. But his eyes weren't holiday anything. His eyes were disciplined. They stayed fixed on the tarp opening, ears flicking at every footstep outside. Mason leaned close to Lily, too. "We move when they move away," he said. Lily shook her head. "They won't. Not until they find me." Her voice was steady, but Mason heard the strain under it. Not fear-anger. The anger of someone who'd trusted a badge and found rot beneath it. Outside, the tall man's flashlight stopped. The beam rested on the paw prints Ranger had planted in the snow-bold, deliberate tracks leading away from the tarp stack. "There," the tall man said. His voice was gravelly, mid-30s maybe, with the kind of roughness that came from too many cigarettes and too few apologies. "Dog went that way." Another man snorted. "Dog ain't the problem," he said. This one had a thicker nasal tone and the impatience of a man who disliked thinking. "Cop is." The tall one hesitated, and Mason felt the momentary opening just a sliver. If they split to follow the tracks, Mason could move Lily. If they stayed, it would turn into a waiting game, and waiting games favored the hunters. Then a fourth voice cut in, calmer than the others. "You're all acting like you've got time," it said. You don't." The speaker stepped into view through the tarp tear, and for the first time Mason saw a face clearly. The man was in his late 40s, lean and angular, with a long nose that had been broken once and healed crooked. Gray stubble covered his jaw in a rough shadow. His eyes were pale washed-out blue, and they held a patient, practiced cruelty. He wore a dark beanie pulled low and a weathered canvas jacket that fit him too well, like he'd chosen it for quiet work. His hands were bare in the cold, knuckles reddened, and they moved with a careful precision that suggested he did not waste effort. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like the kind of man who could shake your hand at a county meeting and later decide you were inconvenient. "Check the stacks," the older man said, voice low. "Tear the tarp if you have to." Lily's throat tightened. Something in the man's posture stirred recognition, a memory she didn't want. Not a name, not yet, just a feeling like cold iron. Mason felt Lily tense and understood that this was not a random crew. This was organized. The older man with pale eyes was the kind of predator who stayed dry in a storm. "We move," Mason mouthed. Lily nodded once. Ranger didn't wait for a second nod. The dog eased backward, silent as smoke, and led them deeper under the tarp, toward the far side where the stacks met a gap between concrete forms. Mason kept one hand on Lily's belt harness and the other on Ranger's shoulder, guiding them in a crouched shuffle that made his knees burn. The tarp rattled overhead as a flashlight beam stabbed inside. A hand yanked at the plastic. Cold air rushed in. Mason felt Lily's breath catch. "Here!" someone barked, and the hunters surged. Mason shoved Lily through the gap first. Ranger went next, then Mason, the last to slip out into open air behind the stack only, to find themselves back on the bridge deck with fog thick and the unfinished span stretching like a frozen tongue over the gorge. They'd escaped the tarp, but the bridge had been waiting like a trap that didn't need teeth. The men poured after them. The stocky one with the crowbar sprinted wide, trying to cut them off from the forest approach. Another man swung his flashlight like a weapon, beam blinding in the fog. Lily skidded on the slick concrete and caught herself with a sharp hiss of pain. Mason yanked her upright by the belt. "Run," he said. Lily's eyes flashed. "No kidding." Ranger raced ahead, choosing a line along the deck where snow was thinner and traction slightly better. Mason followed, pulling Lily with him, but the space was wrong, too open, too exposed. No railings to lean against, no cover but rebar and fog. The hunter's footsteps hammered behind them. "Stop!" Lily shouted, more reflex than belief. "Police!" The word police fell into the fog and landed like a feather. It did nothing. A metal clang rang out, sharp, ugly. The stocky man had grabbed a loose length of rebar or a steel rod from a pile near the deck edge and hurled it like a spear across their path. It skidded and spun, then bounced up at shin height. Ranger, moving fastest, saw it first. He lunged to intercept, not thinking in words, only in instinct, blocked the threat. His paws hit the rod, slipped on snow-glazed steel, and for one sickening heartbeat, his body went weightless. Ranger's hind legs slid. His chest hit the slick concrete. Then he was over the raw lip of the bridge. No guardrail. No second chance falling. The world snapped into silence. Mason's voice tore out of him without permission. "Ranger!" Lily whirled, eyes wide, and saw the dog vanish into fog. The gorge swallowed him like a mouth. Mason lurched toward the edge, but Lily grabbed his arm. "Mason, don't!" Ranger didn't drop cleanly. A split second later, there was a scraping shriek claws on concrete, nails tearing for purchase. Ranger's forepaws caught a lower lip where an unfinished support beam met the deck. Just a narrow ledge, barely more than a seam. His body swung beneath it, heavy and trembling, breath blasting white into the void. Snow shook loose and spiraled down. Mason dropped to his knees, inches from the edge, stomach rolling as he imagined the dog's weight giving way. Lily's face drained of color. She knew that posture. She had been that posture. The bridge had tried to take her in the same way. For half a heartbeat, Lily didn't move. Then something fierce lit behind her eyes. She shoved past Mason, belly flopped onto the concrete, and reached down. "Hold him!" she snapped at Mason, voice sharp with command. Mason obeyed instantly, grabbing Lily's belt harness and bracing his boots wide on the slick deck. The hunters were still behind them, but this moment narrowed down again, just like the rescue before, into a single trembling connection. Lily stretched her arm over the edge, fingers numb, palms stinging where her skin was raw. Ranger's eyes locked onto hers, amber and bright with panic he tried to hide. He whined, a small, choked sound. Lily swallowed hard. "Hey," she said, voice breaking in a way she hated. "Hey, Ranger. Look at me." She reached farther, her shoulders sliding toward the edge, and Mason tightened his grip on her belt, feeling her weight shift dangerously. "Lily," he warned. "I've got it," she hissed. And there was something almost mythic in the symmetry, her words echoing Mason's from earlier, but stronger now because she'd learned what it meant to be the one reaching down. Lily's fingertips brushed fur. Ranger's paw scrabbled, slipping on the lower ledge. Lily caught his foreleg just above the paw, fingers wrapping around thick muscle and winter fur. The dog jerked, instinctively trying to climb, but his hindquarters swung free. Lily's arm screamed with the weight. She grit her teeth until her jaw shook. "Don't fight me," she muttered, half to the dog, half to her own fear. "Let me pull." Mason anchored her, leaning backward with his whole body, boots sliding but holding. He glanced over his shoulder and saw the men closing. 10 yards, maybe less. Their boots crunched, their voices rising with cruel excitement. The older man with pale eyes lifted his flashlight and smiled slightly, like he was watching a show. Lily didn't look back. She couldn't. She kept her gaze on Ranger, like the dog was the only real thing left in the world. "You pulled him for me," she whispered through clenched teeth, and her voice turned strange half-prayer, half-promise. "Now I pull you." Ranger's ears flattened. He kicked once, searching for purchase. Lily hauled upward, inch by inch, using the same method Mason had coached her with. Forearm, elbow, hook, drag. She got Ranger's paw higher, then his other paw. Then she wedged her elbow against the deck edge, using bone as an anchor. Mason added his free hand now, grabbing Ranger's scruff when it came within reach. Together they heaved. Ranger's chest scraped the lower lip, then the upper edge. His nails shrieked against concrete. With a final desperate pull, Ranger's front half cleared the deck and he flopped onto the surface, panting hard, legs trembling. Lily collapsed beside him, cheek pressed to snow, and for a second her breath came out in a sob she refused to name. Ranger turned his head and shoved his nose into her shoulder, like he was checking that she hadn't fallen this time. Mason didn't get to savor relief. The hunters were almost on them. The stocky man raised the crowbar again. The older man's pale eyes watched with calm certainty. Mason hauled Lily to her knees by the belt and pulled Ranger close by the collar. Snow swirled around them. The unfinished bridge offered no safety, only exposure. But something had changed in that exposure. The triangle of trust between them had snapped into place. Lily had pulled Ranger the way Mason had pulled her. Ranger had held Mason the way a rope never could. And now the three of them faced the approaching men with a new kind of unity, the kind born from the simple truth that they had already saved each other once, and they would do it again. The bridge stopped being a bridge and became a runway for death. Mason didn't wait for the men to close the last few steps. He grabbed Lily by the belt harness and pulled her into motion, and Ranger, still trembling from the near fall, forced his legs to obey and ran. Snow stung their faces like thrown salt. The forest swallowed them at the far end of the deck, where half-cleared construction paths cut into the pines and then vanished into untouched drifts. Behind them, the hunters surged off the bridge with loud confidence, boots punching through crusted snow, voices rising as if they enjoyed the chase. Lily stumbled once, her palms were shredded, her arms weak from hauling Ranger, but Mason yanked her upright without slowing, and she hated that she needed it and hated even more that she was grateful. Ranger ran slightly ahead, nose low, choosing routes that bent around windfall and deep powder, guiding them away from open lines of sight. The dog's coat was now streaked with gray snow and a faint smear of blood at one foreleg where concrete had scraped him, but his eyes stayed bright, locked on the job. Mason's lungs burned. The cold made each inhale feel like broken glass. It should have slowed him, should have made him clumsy, but instead it sharpened him the way danger always did. His body remembered winter patrols, remembered moving fast without panicking, remembered that the world could be quiet and lethal at the same time. He forced his thoughts into order. Get off the bridge, break their visual, find cover, buy time. Lily's radio was still useless. She tried it anyway while running, thumb hammering the transmit button as if she could beat signal out of the air. Static answered in a harsh, mocking hiss. "No bars," she gasped, then winced because even saying it felt absurd. Of course there were no bars in a gorgeous throat. Mason didn't answer. He was listening for the sound behind them. Footsteps, voices, the crunch pattern that told him distance. Too close. The men were gaining. Ranger veered sharply into a narrow service lane, an old maintenance track packed down by vehicles months ago, now iced over and mostly forgotten. It curved through dense spruce, and the wind shifted, carrying the sour scent of gasoline and wet metal. Mason caught it too. "Cabin," he said, more to himself than Lily. The path opened into a small clearing where a squat maintenance cabin crouched under snow-laden branches like an animal trying to survive winter. The building was simple. Weathered wood siding, a low roof sagging under white weight, a small porch with a single busted light fixture above the door. A generator box sat to the side, half buried. A rusty ATV frame leaned against a tree like a skeleton. The place looked abandoned, but not forgotten. Mason's mind pictured it instantly as both shelter and trap. Lily saw it, and her shoulders loosened with desperate hope warmth. Walls, something solid between them and knives. Ranger slowed at the porch steps and sniffed, ears flicking. No immediate danger inside. Mason pushed Lily toward the door. "In," he said. Lily yanked at the handle. "Locked." "Of course," she muttered, a brittle edge to her humor. Mason didn't waste time. He shouldered the door near the latch. The wood groaned but held. He struck again, harder, and the frame cracked with a sharp pop. The door swung inward, releasing a stale breath of cold wood and old fuel. They spilled inside. The interior was bare bones, a single room with a dented metal desk, a couple of folding chairs, shelves with scattered bolts and rope, and a small wall-mounted breaker panel. A dusty propane heater sat in the corner, dead. The air smelled of damp pine, rust, and the ghosts of work crews long gone. Lily leaned against the wall, chest heaving, trying not to collapse. Ranger circled once, then planted himself near the doorway, watching. Mason didn't look at any of it longer than a heartbeat. He moved like someone building a plan out of scraps. First, he found the breaker box and flipped switches. Nothing. No power. Then he found the wall lamp by the desk and twisted it. Dead. A cabin with no electricity in winter was not a shelter. It was a box you froze in. Mason scanned for tools. On a shelf, a heavy-duty flashlight with cracked casing, a coil of thin rope, duct tape, and a battered toolbox. He grabbed the flashlight and clicked it. Once weak light sputtered on, then steadied. He didn't keep it on. Light was a beacon. He clicked it off and shoved it into his pocket. Lily watched him with a cop's attention. Even exhausted, she took in the details. The way his hands didn't tremble, the way he checked corners automatically, the way he moved like he'd been taught to survive in places without rules. Her voice came out quieter now, less sharp. "You were infantry?" Mason's jaw tightened. "Marine," he said after a beat. "Not proud of it, just is." Lily nodded once, understanding the difference. Some pasts weren't trophies. They were scars you carried under flannel. Outside, the hunters' voices rose. They'd reached the clearing. Flashlight beams swept past the cabin windows, two small panes crusted with frost. "They went in there," someone barked. Another laughed, delighted. "Good. Saves us walking." Lily's hand went to her holster again. She drew this time, slow, careful. Her sidearm came free with the quiet confidence of training. She checked the chamber by touch. Her hands shook slightly from cold and fatigue, but her grip was solid. Lily Harper had the kind of courage that didn't roar. It clenched its teeth and did the job anyway. Mason pointed to the only two windows and the door. "We can't hold this," he said. "Not long." "Then what?" Lily whispered. Ranger growled softly, deep in his chest, and Mason felt the answer in the dog's body. "Don't wait. Move first. Take control of the moment." Mason's eyes flicked to the busted porch light fixture outside. An idea formed, simple, crude, workable. He grabbed the duct tape and the coil of rope. "Lights," he said to Lily. "They're using flashlights. They'll look for a silhouette. We give them one." Lily frowned. "A decoy?" Mason nodded. "We buy 10 seconds. 10 seconds is a lifetime." He moved to the desk and found an old high-vis vest faded orange, reflective strips dulled. He stuffed it with rags from a shelf, tied it to the rope, and positioned it near the back wall. He taped the rope so it could be yanked, making the vest jerk like a person moving. Crude, but in dim light and stress, it could draw attention. Ranger watched, ears pricked, as if impressed and offended at human creativity simultaneously. Lily's mouth twitched. "That's terrible," she whispered. Mason's eyes stayed flat. "Terrible works." The cabin door rattled. A heavy thud hit it, someone testing the frame. The wood shivered. "Open up!" a voice shouted. The stocky one, Mason guessed, the one who liked crowbars. "Police officer, we know you're in there." Lily's jaw tightened at the insult of it. Criminals pretending authority. She raised her weapon toward the door, breathing through pain. Mason grabbed the flashlight and clicked it on, then covered it with his hand to keep the beam narrow. He aimed it toward the ceiling, letting a faint glow leak around his fingers, just enough to make shadows move. "When they come in," he murmured to Lily. "You don't shoot unless you have to." Lily's eyes flashed. "They're going to kill us." "I know," Mason said, "but if you shoot first in the dark, you might hit Ranger, or me, or—" His voice cracked slightly, and he hated it. He'd spent too long around accidental deaths. He refused to add another. Ranger shifted closer to Lily's leg, like he'd chosen sides in a war. The door slammed again. A metal scrape followed crowbar biting into the cracked frame. The latch groaned. Lily tensed. Mason tightened his grip on the rope connected to the decoy. The door burst inward with a violent crack, and cold air rushed in like a living thing. Two men surged into the cabin, flashlights stabbing light across walls. The tall one came first, shoulders square, face half hidden under a hood. Behind him the stocky man entered with the crowbar raised, eyes glittering with the thrill of control. Their beams swept the room, and Mason yanked the rope. The high-vis vest jerked in the corner like a person trying to hide. "There!" the tall man shouted, and both men pivoted toward the decoy, flashlight snapping to it. That was Mason's 10 seconds. He grabbed Lily's belt harness and pulled her low, moving behind the desk where the angle forced the intruders to turn their backs. Lily brought her gun up, tracking carefully. Ranger slipped forward, silent, positioning near the stocky man's legs. The tall man advanced on the vest, crowbar man close behind, and then realized too late that the person was wrong. "It's a—" the tall man began. Mason moved. He slammed his shoulder into the tall man's ribs from the side, using the man's surprise and the cramped space. The tall man crashed into the wall. His flashlight flew, spinning light across the ceiling like a crazed star. Lily shouted, "Drop it!" But her voice barely mattered now. The room had become pure motion. The stocky man swung the crowbar toward Mason's head. Mason ducked, felt wind and iron pass inches above his hair. He drove an elbow into the man's stomach. The stocky man grunted but didn't go down thick, stubborn. He reached into his jacket and drew a knife, the blade catching a flash of spinning light. The knife wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. In a tight room, a knife was a promise. Lily aimed at his chest. "Knife down!" "Sub," she barked, breath ragged. The stocky man laughed and lunged. Mason sidestepped, but his boot slid on the icy floorboards near the door. For a heartbeat, his balance broke. The knife shot forward, aimed for Mason's ribs. Ranger launched. The German Shepherd hit the man's forearm like a missile, jaws clamping not on the knife but on the wrist that guided it. The blade still drove forward, but Ranger's impact deflected it. The knife plunged into Ranger's shoulder instead of Mason's body, burying with a sickening thud. Ranger yelped once, a sound that cut through the room like glass shattering. Lily screamed his name, not a command, a plea. The stocky man jerked back in shock, yanking the knife free. Blood burst dark against tan fur. Ranger staggered but didn't retreat. He stood between Mason and the blade, legs trembling, eyes furious. Mason's face went cold. Something in him snapped into a sharper, older mode one that didn't think in mercy. He grabbed the stocky man's wrist, twisted hard, and drove him into the desk edge. Bone popped, or maybe it was just the man's grunt. Either way, the knife clattered to the floor. Lily kicked it away and kept her gun trained, shaking with rage and fear. Ranger's blood spread across the cabin floor, steaming faintly in the cold. Mason dropped to one knee beside the dog, one hand hovering, not sure where to touch without hurting more. Lily moved faster. She tore at the hem of her uniform shirt, ripping a strip of fabric with brutal force, ignoring the sting in her scraped palms. She pressed the cloth to Ranger's wound, hands firm, voice suddenly calm in the way medics got when panic wasn't allowed. "Pressure," she ordered Mason. "Hold pressure." Mason obeyed, pressing down, feeling Ranger's muscles twitch under his palm. Ranger's breath came fast. His eyes locked on Mason's face as if to say, "Don't you dare stop now." Outside, more footsteps pounded toward the cabin, more voices. They weren't done. Mason looked up, blood on his hands, and saw Lily's eyes, gray-blue, fierce, wet, with something she refused to let fall. The hunt had reached the cabin, and now it had taken payment in blood. The cabin felt smaller once blood hit the floor. It wasn't just the smell iron and wet fur and cold wood. It was the way danger suddenly had a shape you could touch. Ranger's shoulder pumped dark red into Lily's makeshift bandage, and the snow tracked in by boots turned pink where it melted on the boards. The German Shepherd tried to stay upright because pride lives in working dogs the same way it lives in soldiers, stubborn and stupid and beautiful. His legs trembled. His breath came in harsh, rattling bursts, a sound like wind scraping across a fence. Mason's hands were on the wound, pressing hard the way Lily had ordered, but the pressure made him feel the knife again, feel the moment Ranger had launched into it without hesitation. Mason had seen men do that for each other overseas, jump into a blast radius, shove a buddy behind cover, but seeing a dog do it hit him in a different place. It wasn't strategy. It was devotion without language. Lily knelt close, her face pale under the windburn, eyes sharp and wet all at once. She'd already torn strips from her uniform shirt, and now, without stopping to think, she reached under her duty vest and ripped more fabric, bigger, sturdier. The motion was fierce, almost angry. She didn't tear cloth like someone improvising. She tore it like someone refusing to negotiate with fate. Her fingers shook, not from fear, but from cold and adrenaline dumping out of her system. "I need a tighter wrap," she muttered, more to herself than Mason. "He's bleeding through." Mason's jaw flexed. He kept pressure with one hand and reached for the coil of rope with the other. Lily glanced at it and nodded. "Good. Cut a short length." Mason grabbed a multi-tool from the battered box and sliced through rope fibers with a quick sawing motion. Outside, footsteps crunched closer. Voices rose again, muffled by the cabin walls but near enough to feel. Someone pounded the outer wall once, like a bully testing how scared the room would get. Ranger flinched at the sound, then tried to lift his head, ears twitching. His amber eyes locked on the door. Even wounded, he still wanted to guard. Mason leaned close to him. "Easy, Captain," he murmured, trying to keep humor in his voice, because humor was sometimes the only way to keep terror from eating the air. Ranger's eyes flicked to Mason's face, then back to the door like he didn't believe in jokes during emergencies. Lily slid her hand under Ranger's chest, supporting his weight while Mason kept pressure. "Ranger," she said softly, and the dog's gaze returned to her. There was something almost human in it, fear, loyalty, and a strange, offended dignity. Lily swallowed. "Stay with us." She wrapped the fresh cloth around the wound, pulling it tight, and Mason saw her hands move with surprising skill. Not graceful, but effective. The knot she tied was deliberate, strong, the kind you make when you've carried someone heavier than your own fear. Lily Harper was not a medic, but she was a cop, and cops learned early that help didn't always arrive on time. She cinched the rope over the cloth to create pressure, then pressed her palm against it, checking the flow. The bleeding slowed to a seep. Ranger's breath steadied by a fraction. "Good," Lily whispered, as if praising the knot would praise the universe into behaving. Mason looked at her then, really looked. Under the uniform grime and the scraped palms, she had a hard kind of beauty. Sharp cheekbones, a small scar on her chin, hair dark and messy now, and eyes that had seen too much betrayal to ever be naive again. Her toughness wasn't performative, it was forged. Mason understood forged. It was how he'd survived his own turning points. The day he came home and found silence louder than gunfire. The day he learned that peace could feel like a trap because it left room for memories to walk around. Lily's voice snapped him back. "Mason, look at him." He blinked. "What?" "Look," Lily repeated, firm. She grabbed Mason's chin with 2 fingers, gentle but unyielding, and forced his gaze down to Ranger. The dog's eyes were still bright, still fighting, but they were glazing at the edges with exhaustion. "Don't you go soft on me," Lily said, voice low and trembling with controlled fury. "Not now. Don't let him do this for nothing." Mason felt something inside his chest crack, not break, crack like ice under pressure, letting a sliver of feeling leak out. He hated it. He wanted to shove it back down where the dead lived quietly, but Ranger's blood was on his hands, warm against freezing air, and Lily's words pinned him to the moment. "He won't," Mason said. The vow came out harsher than he intended, like a promise made to a god he didn't trust. "He won't." Ranger tried to shift, as if to stand. His front leg buckled. Lily pushed him gently back down, one hand on his neck, fingers threading into thick fur. "Stop showing off," she whispered, and there was a faint laugh in it, small dark humor to keep the room from drowning. Ranger's mouth opened and closed in a silent huff, almost offended by the suggestion that he'd ever do anything dramatic. Outside, a voice called, calmer than the others. The older man, the one with pale eyes, spoke through the door as if he were announcing the weather. "You're running out of options," he said. "Open the door and we'll make this quick." Lily's face hardened. She lifted her gun, aiming at the door. Mason caught her wrist. "Wait," he whispered. Lily's eyes flashed. "Wait for what? For him to bleed out?" "For them to come in," Mason said. "We can't sit here and let them decide how this ends." He turned his head slightly, listening. There were at least 2 men outside the door now, maybe the third near the window. They were tightening the circle. Mason's mind ran through the cabin like a map. The desk, the chairs, the shelf, the narrow back window with frost crusted on the pane, the propane heater that might be useless but still heavy enough to swing, the floorboards that creaked near the entry. In Helmand, he'd learned that when you couldn't win a firefight, you changed the terrain. You made the enemy fight where they couldn't use their advantage. Here, their advantage was numbers and weapons. Mason's advantage, what little he had, was thinking under pressure, and a dog who refused to quit. Lily's advantage was aim, authority, and fury. But Ranger's wound changed everything. They couldn't sprint through deep snow now. They needed a move that didn't require speed. Lily's voice softened, just a fraction. "Mason," she said, and for the first time her tone wasn't command. It was something like trust, hesitant and new. "Why are you so calm?" Mason let out a breath that looked like smoke. "I'm not calm," he admitted. "I'm functioning." He glanced down at Ranger, whose breath still rattled but held. The dog's eyes tracked Mason like a tether. Mason felt the old guilt rise faces he couldn't save, the dog from his unit he never found, the silence after. It tried to swallow him. Then Lily's hand pressed against Ranger's bandage again, steady. And Mason realized what had shifted. This wasn't his war, but the same rules applied. Save the living. Don't freeze. Don't apologize to fear. Lily leaned close to Ranger's face, speaking to him like he understood every syllable. "You did your job," she whispered. "Now let us do ours." Ranger's ears twitched. He made a low sound, half groan, half complaint, then settled, because even pride eventually yields to pain. Mason stood, rolling his shoulder once, ignoring the ache. He scanned the cabin again and spotted a length of chain on a hook, rusty, heavy, meant for towing. He took it down and tested the weight in his hand. It would do. Lily watched him, reading the intent in his posture. She adjusted her grip on the gun, her breathing slowing into the steady rhythm of someone preparing for a fight. "If they come in," she said quietly, "I can drop one." Mason nodded. "And if they don't," he replied, "we make them." Outside, the older man's voice returned, patient as a funeral bell. "Last chance," he called. "You're not leaving that cabin." Lily's mouth tightened. She leaned over Ranger, touched his head once, a brief gesture that looked like both apology and promise. Then she looked up at Mason, eyes bright with a hard kind of love, not romantic, not soft, but the fierce love of people who refuse to let the world take what they've already bled for. "Don't you quit," she said again, quieter now, and this time she wasn't only talking about Ranger. Mason's answer was a simple nod. He moved into position beside the door, chain in hand, body angled to strike the moment the frame gave way. Lily crouched near the desk, gun trained on the entry, using furniture as partial cover. Ranger lay between them, breath still rough but present, eyes open, watching, refusing sleep. Like sleep was betrayal. The cabin held its breath with them, and in that held breath Mason felt the strangest thing. Not peace, not yet, but connection. A cracked veteran, a wounded police officer, a bleeding dog who still tried to stand. 3 lives stitched together by cold, by violence, and by the choice to keep pulling each other back from the edge. The cabin's silence was not peace. It was a held breath, the kind the forest takes when predators get close enough to smell blood. Outside, boots moved in slow arcs through the snow, crunching, pausing, crunching again, men spreading out like fingers searching for a throat. The older man with the pale eyes spoke once more, calm as a priest at the wrong altar. "You can't hide in there forever," he said. "Open the door." Mason didn't answer. He stood beside the frame with the rusted chain wrapped once around his fist, the weight of it grounding him. His posture wasn't rage. It was readiness, economical, quiet, final. Lily crouched behind the desk, gun trained on the entry, her breathing forced into a steady cadence. Ranger lay between them, bandaged tight, chest rising and falling in rough, stubborn surges. The dog's eyes stayed open. He watched the door like he was willing it to behave. Mason listened with the part of him that had survived Helmand. The rhythm of steps, the pause that meant a hand on a weapon, the slight shuffle of someone trying to get an angle. He could almost see them through the wood. The first hit came without warning, a heavy slam against the door that rattled the hinges. The second hit followed immediately, louder, crowbar biting into the cracked jamb. The frame groaned. Lily's finger tightened on the trigger but didn't fire. Mason stayed still. He didn't waste energy flinching. He waited for the moment when the door became an opening instead of a barrier. A third slam, then the door burst inward in a splintered cough of wood. Cold air poured in. 2 flashlights stabbed through the gap, beams jittering across the room. Mason stepped into the darkness between those beams and struck. The chain snapped out like a comet's tail, whipping across the first intruder's wrist. Metal bit bone. The man yelped, flashlight clattering to the floor, light spinning wild. Mason didn't follow the scream. He followed the opening. He drove his shoulder forward, slammed the man into the door edge, and used the momentum to pivot into the second intruder before the second could raise his weapon. It wasn't a clean punch, it was a brutal elbow to the jaw, the kind that shut down speech and thought at once. The second man stumbled back, coughing. Lily fired once, not at a head, not even at a chest, at the floor beside his boot. The shot cracked the cabin like thunder. Splinters jumped. The man froze, shock widening his eyes. "Drop it!" Lily barked, voice steel. The man's hands went up. His weapon, a small pistol, fell into the snow just inside the doorway. Lily moved fast, snapping forward, kicking the gun away with the heel of her boot while keeping her own muzzle trained. Her scraped palms didn't slow her. Pain didn't get votes right now. Mason grabbed the first man by the collar and slammed him against the wall, forcing him down, using the chain as leverage around the forearm. The man's breath came out in a wet gasp. Mason's face stayed blank, and that blankness was more terrifying than anger. Anger was noisy. Blankness meant decision. The older man's voice outside shifted, still calm, but sharper now, like a knife drawn from velvet. "He's trained," he said. "Don't rush him." Another set of boots moved to the side window. Mason heard the crunch, heard the pause, heard a faint scrape against the glass frame. A flank. Mason's mind lit up with geometry. Door breach, window breach, crossfire potential. Lily glanced at the window and understood too. "Left," she breathed. Mason nodded once. Ranger's ears twitched. The dog tried to rise, failed, then forced himself up anyway, front legs braced, bandage darkening with fresh seep. A low growl rolled out of him, quiet, furious, loyal. The side window blew inward with a brittle crash. Cold shards sprayed. A man tried to climb through, shoulders first, flashlight beam shooting into the cabin. Mason moved like he was already there. He grabbed the folding chair and hurled it hard into the man's chest mid-entry. The chair struck with a hollow smack and toppled, tangling the man in metal legs. The man cursed and flailed, half in, half out. Lily lunged forward and slammed her forearm across the man's throat in a quick choke press, forcing him backward. She didn't hold it long, just long enough to make him gasp and retreat. "Back out!" she snapped, and the man scrambled away from the window like the cabin had teeth. Another attacker rushed the doorway with a knife-short blade, bright in the spinning flashlight glow. He didn't hesitate. He went for Mason's ribs again, because some men only learned one sentence in their whole life. Mason shifted his weight, let the lunge pass, and trapped the attacker's wrist with both hands. He didn't wrestle. He redirected. He twisted the wrist, stepped behind the man, and drove the man's face into the desk corner with controlled force. Bone thudded against wood. The knife fell. Mason kicked it away without looking. Lily caught the first intruder who'd surrendered, yanked his arms behind him, and cinched a zip tie from her belt around his wrists. Fast, practiced, anger, efficient. "Stay down," she hissed into his ear, and the man did. Ranger suddenly moved, staggering, but moving toward the open doorway. Mason's instincts screamed at him to pull the dog back, but Ranger's focus was elsewhere. A shadow slipped along the cabin's outer wall, silent, trying to circle behind Lily's position near the desk. Ranger saw it. He launched, wounded shoulder screaming, and slammed into the shadow's legs at the exact moment the man tried to step in through the back corner gap. Ranger's teeth clamped onto pant fabric and calf, not to kill, just to stop. The man howled and stumbled. Lily spun and fired again, another warning shot, close enough to make snow erupt near the man's foot. The man jerked back instinctively. That half-second gave Mason time. Mason crossed the cabin in 2 strides, grabbed the man by the hood, and yanked him forward into the wall, pinning him with his forearm across the collarbone. "Enough," Mason said softly. The word wasn't a threat. It was a closing statement. The man tried to swing. Mason didn't block with his hands, he blocked with his body, absorbing the motion, then drove a knee into the man's thigh. The leg gave. Mason took him down with a hard twist, and the man hit the floor with a grunt that sounded like surrender. For a moment the cabin filled with overlapping sounds, groans, ragged breathing, the hiss of wind through the broken window, Ranger's strained panting. Lily stood with her gun up, scanning, shoulders tight, hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and melting snow. Mason's chest rose and fell in a controlled rhythm. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who had turned off something inside himself to do what had to be done. The older man outside didn't rush in. He paused. Mason heard him shifting in the snow, heard his patience recalculating. "All right," the older man said, voice still level, but now it carried something colder. Respect. The kind predators give other predators. "You've got skill. I'll give you that." Lily's eyes flicked to Mason. "Who is he?" she whispered. "The one outside?" Mason shook his head slightly. "Not yet," he murmured, "but he's the brain." Ranger limped back toward Lily, shoulder bleeding again, but his eyes proud as if he'd just won a medal. Lily dropped to a knee beside him, one hand on his collar, the other steadying his chest. "You're going to get yourself killed," she whispered, voice cracking, half scold, half devotion. Ranger huffed in her face like she was being dramatic. Mason's gaze stayed on the doorway. He could feel the next move coming, the silence changing shape. The cabin was full of downed men, but the hunt wasn't over. It had simply reached that terrifying pause, the pause before an ending tries to right itself. Outside, the older man's footsteps retreated a few steps, crunching, then stopped. Mason's eyes narrowed. Retreat could mean regroup, or it could mean a gun. Lily rose again, shifting position so she could cover the doorway and the broken window. She spoke through clenched teeth. "We can't stay here." Mason nodded. "We won't." He grabbed the rope and looped it under Ranger's chest like a sling, improvising a way to help the dog move without putting full weight on the wounded shoulder. Ranger tolerated it with offended dignity, as if he'd prefer to drag himself just to prove a point. Mason almost smiled, but didn't. He didn't allow himself that softness yet, not while the older man still breathed outside. The wind pressed against the cabin like a hand on a coffin lid. Snow drifted through the broken window and landed on the floorboards like silent ash. Mason listened again, carefully, relentlessly, and realized something that made his stomach tighten. The older man wasn't moving the way someone moves when they're scared. He was moving the way someone moves when they've decided to end it. Then came the worst sound of all. Not boots, not shouting, not a crowbar. Just the faint click of metal being readied. A gun. Lily heard it too. Her eyes widened, then hardened. Mason's grip tightened on the chain. Ranger's ears snapped forward. And in that moment, as groans faded and wind filled the gaps, the cabin held a different kind of silence, one that felt like the world drawing a line and daring them to step over it. The cabin finally exhaled, but the forest did not. Mason stepped through the broken doorway first, chain still in his hand, eyes sweeping the clearing with the same careful patience he used on dark streets and darker memories. Cold slammed into his lungs. Snow drifted sideways in thin sheets, brushing his cheeks like the fingers of something curious. Lily followed, gun raised, shoulders squared, even though her arms trembled from fatigue. Ranger came last, half walking, half supported by the sling Mason had rigged under his chest. The German shepherd's bandage had soaked through again, the cloth dark and heavy, and each breath came with a strained wheeze that tried to hide as toughness. Ranger still lifted his head at every sound, still wanted to lead, still wanted to pretend he wasn't bleeding. Lily stayed close to him, one hand steadying the sling, the other pressing the bandage whenever Ranger lurched. "You're not dying on me," she muttered, voice rough, like a vow made in anger at winter itself. Mason didn't look back, but he heard it, and something in him loosened, just a fraction, because for a moment it sounded like family. Behind them, inside the cabin, the downed men groaned and shifted. Lily had zip-tied one. Mason had pinned another. But none of that meant the night was over. Mason could feel it in his spine, the way sailors feel storms before clouds arrive. He remembered the click Lily had heard, the final soft sound of metal being readied. That wasn't a desperate man. That was a decision. "Move," Mason said low. "We don't stay in the clearing." Lily nodded and guided Ranger toward the tree line. Their boots sank into powder, muffling footsteps. The pines stood tall and indifferent, branches sagging with snow like heavy brows. The air smelled of sap and old ice. Somewhere far off, water moved under frozen skin. They reached the first line of trees and Mason stopped. Not because he wanted to, but because his instincts shoved him still. The clearing behind them was wrong too quiet now. No voices, no rushing, no crowbar scraping. The silence had become clean, polished. That kind of silence belonged to one person. Mason turned slowly, scanning the white haze between trunks. Lily followed his gaze, gun tracking with it. Ranger's ears pricked, then flattened. A low growl seeped out of him, thick with warning. He was exhausted, but danger still woke him like a bell. A figure stepped from the fog at the edge of the clearing as if the night itself had decided to wear a man's shape. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply appeared, calm, unhurried, certain. The older man with the pale eyes. Up close he looked even more deliberate. Late 40s, maybe early 50s. Lean, angular face with a broken nose tilt that made his profile sharp. Gray stubble cut along his jaw like sandpaper. His pale blue eyes were the worst part flat and light, like winter sky that never promised warmth. He wore the same weathered canvas jacket, the same dark beanie pulled low, and his hands were still bare, knuckles red but steady. A man who didn't mind cold, a man who didn't mind blood. He lifted a handgun, black, compact, fitted with a short suppressor that made it look clinical, like a tool rather than a weapon. He aimed it at the space where all three of them overlapped. Not at Mason alone, not at Lily alone. At the triangle, at the bond. "That's far enough," he said softly. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It carried like a lid closing. Lily's breath caught. Mason's body shifted without thinking, one step forward, shoulders angling to block, chain hanging at his side like a relic. He could feel Lily behind him, the heat of her presence and the tremor of her arms as she tried to keep the gun steady. Ranger's growl turned hoarse, strained by pain, but it was still a growl. The boss's mouth twitched, almost amused. "I told them not to rush you," he said to Mason, as if they were discussing bad employees. "Some men only learn after they've paid the lesson twice." Lily's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" she demanded. Her voice carried the authority of the badge even now, even here, even with snow clinging to her lashes. The man's gaze flicked to her insignia, then to her face. "Officer Lily Harper," he said, pronouncing her name like he'd read it off a file and enjoyed that he could. Lily went still. Her knuckles whitened around the grip of her sidearm. "You know me," she said. "I know of you," he corrected calmly. "And I know what you saw." Mason felt the truth settle heavy. This wasn't just a random ambush at a bridge. This was a cleanup. They'd meant to erase Lily like a smudge. Mason's jaw clenched. "You're the one behind the bridge site," he said. The man's eyes stayed pale, patient. "Behind?" he repeated, as if the word was too dramatic. "Let's call it managing complications." He took a step closer, boots barely crunching. He moved like he trusted the snow, like he owned the terrain. "It's over," he said then, and the sentence was so short it felt like a shovel of dirt. "It ends here." Lily's hand slid down to Ranger's shoulder, fingers pressing hard over the soaked bandage. Ranger shuddered, then forced his legs to brace, trembling. He was trying to stand tall in front of death. Mason felt his throat tighten with a fury he refused to show. He remembered people who'd pointed guns at him overseas with the same calm. He remembered the feeling of being reduced to a target, a number, a line item. Not again. He shifted his weight, subtly positioning so the boss would have to shoot through him to reach Lily and Ranger. "You're making a mistake," Mason said, voice low. The boss's eyes flicked over Mason's stance recognition, not fear. "No," he said, "my mistake was assuming you'd die quietly." He tightened his finger along the trigger. The suppressor pointed like a punctuation mark. Lily's gun rose a fraction, but Mason could feel the math. She couldn't shoot without risking Ranger, without risking Mason. And even if she did, the boss had already committed to a shot. Ranger's growl turned into a rasp. His tail quivered. He didn't back away. He couldn't. He was too loyal to retreat. The boss smiled faintly, a smile with no warmth in it. "People like you always think someone is coming," he murmured. "Someone always thinks the cavalry shows up." Mason felt Lily's breath behind him, ragged. The world narrowed to the circle of that muzzle. A heartbeat. Another. The kind of pause where fate chooses a lane. Then the air split open. A deep rising thunder rolled across the treetops, so sudden and massive it made snow shake loose from branches in white bursts. Ranger's ears snapped up. Lily's head jerked skyward. Mason's eyes widened. Rotor blades. The sound wasn't just loud, it was physical, pressing down on the forest like a god's hand. The boss's calm cracked for the first time. His gaze flicked upward, jaw tightening. A searchlight punched through the haze, bright as a falling star. It swept across the clearing, carving the snow into blinding silver and shadow. The beam found them Mason, Lily, Ranger, and then slid to the boss, freezing him in a white circle like judgment. Above the tree line, a helicopter hovered low, dark shape against the pale sky, its lights cutting through snow like blades. The downwash whipped the forest into chaos. Snow spiraled, branches thrashed. Breath turned into a storm of vapor. A loudspeaker crackled. Then a voice boomed down, commanding, crisp, impossible to ignore. "Drop the weapon! Hands where we can see them!" The boss hesitated, just a half-second. But in a night made of half-seconds, that hesitation was an earthquake. Lily's eyes went hard. She shifted her stance and aimed properly now, using the light as cover, the helicopter as authority. "Drop it!" she shouted, her voice joining the roar. Mason didn't move toward the boss yet. He waited, watching the man's shoulders, reading intent. The boss's pistol dipped slightly, not from surrender, but from calculation, how to run, where to vanish. Another beam swept in second helicopter, or the same one repositioning hard to tell through the snowblast. The loudspeaker barked again. "On your knees, now!" The boss's mouth tightened. He looked at Mason with something like resentment, as if Mason had cheated. Then the snow at the boss's feet exploded. Warning shots kicked up powder. The boss flinched, and that was enough. Mason lunged. The chain flashed in the searchlight. He wrapped it around the boss's wrist in a brutal snap and yanked, twisting the gun free. The boss tried to swing his free hand, but Mason drove his shoulder into him and slammed him down into the snow. The pistol skittered away, swallowed by white. Lily rushed forward, kicked the weapon farther, then dropped to a knee and snapped cuffs onto the boss's wrists with shaking hands. Her breathing was ragged now, relief and fury colliding in her chest. Ranger collapsed onto his side with a soft groan, his body finally allowing what pride had denied. Lily immediately turned to him, pressing the bandage again, fingers sticky with blood and melting snow. "Stay with me," she whispered, voice breaking. "Stay." The helicopter lowered slightly, lights sweeping. Figures in dark tactical gear moved through the tree's high-level responders, faces obscured by helmets and goggles, weapons ready but disciplined. One of them, a tall operator with broad shoulders and a steady gait, knelt beside Ranger and assessed the wound fast. Another approached Lily and spoke into a radio. Their presence didn't feel like rescue from a movie. It felt like order returning, heavy and undeniable. A medic hurried in next. A woman in her 30s with a compact, athletic build, dark hair tucked under a helmet, and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her hands moved with practiced calm as she pulled a trauma kit from her pack. She glanced at Lily. "Keep pressure," she ordered. Lily obeyed instantly, like the medic's voice was the first trustworthy thing she'd heard all night. Mason stood a step back, chest heaving, snow plastered to his boots. He watched as Ranger was lifted carefully onto a stretcher. The dog's eyes fluttered. His ears twitched at Mason's voice when Mason whispered, Good boy." Ranger gave the faintest huff, like agreement. Lily clung to Ranger's paw as they carried him, her gloved fingers wrapped around it with an intensity that looked like prayer. She didn't let go until the medic forced her to step aside. Mason looked up at the helicopter lights carving the storm. The bridge without railings had tried to erase them. The forest had tried to swallow them. Men with knives and guns had tried to turn them into silence. And yet above the white world, a machine thundered like modern thunder gods, dragging light into the dark. Mason let out a tired laugh that surprised even him, short, rough, real. "A bridge with no guardrails," he said, voice hoarse, "and the sky still made a way." Lily looked at him, eyes shining, exhaustion carved into her face. Ranger, half conscious on the stretcher, let out a tiny snort that sounded like the closest thing to a yes. That night, in a winter forest sharp as broken glass, an unfinished bridge tried to swallow 3 lives. Yet a hand still caught in time, a set of jaws still pulled with everything it had, and a heartbeat refused to quit. People call it luck. But some moments don't fit inside the word luck. Some moments feel like mercy, quiet, precise, and perfectly timed. Because miracles don't always arrive as thunder and fire. Sometimes they arrive as a stubborn choice. A man who doesn't walk away, a woman who refuses to surrender, a wounded dog who still steps forward to take the blade meant for someone else. And if there is something of God in this story, it is grace, not the kind that removes all pain, but the kind that sends help at the exact second you're about to let go. And life, everyday life, has its own edges. Maybe you're not hanging over a canyon, but you've stood on the ledge of exhaustion, loneliness, grief, or a day so heavy you wondered how you'd carry it. And sometimes God doesn't send angels with wings. Sometimes He sends a phone call at the right time, a stranger who chooses kindness, a loyal dog who looks at you like you're still worth saving, or a small door opening when every other door felt locked. If you're tired today, remember this: God still works in the quiet places through steady hands, faithful hearts, and the kind of love that shows up and stays. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope tonight. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe God still works miracles in unexpected ways, type Amen so we can pray together. Don't forget to like and subscribe, because here we tell stories that remind the world hope may be silent sometimes, but it always finds a way. May God bless you and your family, keep you safe, and send you the right hand at the right moment on the day you need it most.